All right. I have another shortcut to add. We are in Romans chapter 11. Verse 7 or so. We don't have Holly here today. They're going to another church this morning, having a little bit of trouble in that regard. It's a tough thing, finding a new church.
Oh, they're visiting on Wednesday.
Yeah, I think they visited quite a few of them. Hopefully they can go someplace where they both can do the things that they did here. Some of that can be hard to work into. Well, all of it, like you playing the piano or what, teaching a Sunday school class, you can take, lots of people want to do that sort of thing. And it can take years to get back to it. That's just one of the reasons it's not good to move churches if you don't have to.
But yeah, Vic's sister's family is leaving the Methodist church because of this homosexual issue. So they're having a hard time. She was the choir director.
Yeah.
All her life there.
Yeah,
So
it's not like you can just walk into another church and be the choir.
yeah.
Yeah. All righty. See what I want to review today. Somebody's sending me a message. Hold on. It's just like work where I got to keep track of this stuff. Yeah. All righty. Let's see, what do we got here? Romans 11. The centrality, not the centrality, but the, what do you call it? Pervasiveness of Isaiah in the New Testament tradition. It's not secret, it's unemphasized. It's just below the tree line. It's hard to see, but Isaiah is just all over, particularly in Luke and Acts, more so in Luke, and then in Paul's letters. I never really noticed it. And I wonder if the reason it's so prominent in Luke's writings is precisely because he was some kind of attendant of associate of Paul. And we're going to see another example of the connection between Acts and Romans today. There's a lot of, no, there's not. In the secular world, there's not a lot of debate about Acts. They don't think, a lot of people don't think that Luke, the person who wrote Luke could have, the person who wrote Acts could have known Paul. And I find the thought ridiculous. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But that's a very prominent idea in New Testament scholarship. And the Gospels, what we think of as the preaching might seem different a little bit, but I don't get it. We'll get back to that sometime. Anyway, you can see it here. Isaiah, we're going to talk about Elijah and 1 Kings chapter 19 after the fall of Israel, really the collapse of the spiritual life of Israel when Solomon went out the deep end and the nation collapsed, divided and then collapsed into idolatry. And that started a downward, that was in 930s or so BC. And that started a downward spiral that would end for the northern kingdom in 722 BC when the Assyrians conquered Israel, northern Israel. And that was the climax of about 200 years of apostasy on the part of Israel. This stuff doesn't come out of nowhere. The kingdom divided, immediately collapsed into idolatry. Prophets start appearing in the 700s, 150 years later or something like that. And then in 722, it's over for the northern kingdom. More prophets appear in the south after the fall of the northern kingdom, and then their time ends in 586 or 7 BC when the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom. And then that creates the dispersion, what we think of as these we'll find our, that's when we think of the dispersion, we talk about the dispersion. In fact, there's 2 letters that are written explicitly, maybe 3, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, which is a result of those 2 exiles. What are those letters that were written to the dispersion?
Peter.
Where's Peter? 2 Peter 2. It's all on it.
Hebrews.
Nope. Hebrews not stated where it's written to. See, 2 Peter Nope, not. But First Peter,
12 tribes scattered abroad.
scattered throughout the eastern provinces. Paul visited Galatia, Asia. He did not get up to Bithynia or Pontus. Pontus is where Aquila was from before he went to Rome. And then on to Corinth. We meet him with Priscilla, of course. But the other letter is James. Was also written, which is really kind of ironic because James, even among the Jews, the non-Christian Jews, was known for his devotion to Moses, to the traditions. And as far as we know, he never left Jerusalem. So it's interesting that he wrote a letter. What prompted it, we don't know, but he wrote a letter to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad, unspecified. He's, of course, talking to the 12 tribes of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. We're back to Rome. What can I say? We are back to Rome. I did not set you up. This was not intentional to get you back on Rome. But so here's his missionary journeys. I mean, you can't talk about Paul's missionary journeys without talking about Rome. But here's the eastern provinces right here. This is the territory, the terrain of the proclamation in Acts. And it's the setting for all of the letters. Here's Bithynia and Pontus. How did the gospel even get there? It's not recorded in any book of the New Testament. It's just simply by the time James writes his letter, or Peter writes his first letter, gospel is simply there in the north, the very northern edge of the Roman Empire. So, pretty sure Paul didn't go there. This is as far north as he's recorded as going right here. So, it just finds its way. It's just there, making its way, much to the chagrin of the Romans, the Jews. Okay. After that sidetrack, I just wanted you to see this, this Isaiah can seem like just one of the prophets, and he is just one of the prophets. But as far as understanding the New Testament, there's no prophet that's more important, maybe that's as important as Isaiah, or even for understanding who Jesus is, in terms of particularly what we call his passion, his suffering, the last week of his life. It's just backlit with Isaiah. And that emphasis continues in Romans. We'll get to now. We are in verse 7. We never looked at, previous to that, in verse 5. I'm in James, thank you. We'll go back, let's see. Yeah, this chapter opens up with Paul quoting what he just simply calls a passage that says in Isaiah, in Elijah, there's no book of Elijah. What he means is something about in the telling of the story of Elijah, where it's from Elijah's standpoint, it's him against the world, the world being his fellow Israelites. Because by now, in the 800s, within whatever 80 years or less of the fall of the division of the kingdom, it's completely collapsed into idolatry. And so he just simply mentions Elijah, and Elijah then to the Romans is expected to be synonymous with essentially the idolatry of Israel, the apostasy of Israel. And you can see once again, like we did in in the book of Judges, apostasy rears its head again in Israel. So it's not this thing that's potentially can just happen to an individual. The Old Testament is a telling of the sort of in a sense, the cyclical apostasies of Israel. And so you see it with starting right from the Exodus generation, the first generation, where there was this apostasy in Numbers chapter 14, and really in Exodus 32 at Sinai, there was an apostasy, a falling away into idolatry. And then again in Numbers 14, as they're about to enter the land, there's a mutiny against Aaron and Moses, and they want to go back to Egypt. That's a falling away or a falling back. We go on, period of the Judges, which is these 6 cycles of apostasy on the part of Israel. brought back from the brink by these judges, by these redeemers. I'm sorry, these saviors that God sends. Who do we have there? Gideon, Japheth, so on and so forth. Continues on. You get into the period of the divided kingdom. Saul comes in, he brings them back from the brink of apostasy in the period of the judges. Really, Samuel does. David solidifies that. David's son Solomon, who had all the blessings, then ignites the great apostasy of Israel. The kingdom divides, and now it's an unbroken period of 350 or so years of apostasy on the part of Israel. And that period produces prophets like Isaiah, who warn the nation about their apostasy. And that this apostasy, the one you're in right now, is going to be the last straw. So when this happened in the book of Judges, God brought them back, and brought them back, and brought them back. But God is not going to allow them to simply be assimilated into the Canaanite world, where they just become another tribe of Canaanite idolaters. He's finished with that. They're not going there. Instead, what he will do is he will eject them from the land. And that will be the consequences of their apostasy this time. And so these prophets start appearing, warning them that that's what's coming this time. You're going to lose the land. And that, of course, eventually happens in the two stages, northern and southern kingdoms. And they lose it all. And what is it, Deuteronomy 31 or whatever, the warnings of the curses of the covenant. And so now, in the New Testament, what we see is the world created from the fallout of that apostasy and then exile, where they have now been absorbed and Hellenized by the Greeks, and then the followers after the Greeks, and then the Romans. And now they are a part. They have settled in as as the Jewish dispersion, diaspora, in these eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, where they landed after the exile. Paul is one of those. Paul was born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a Roman colony. Their family did quite well in the exile, but we see a snapshot then when he appears on the scene in Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 8. That's a snapshot of the dispersion at that point, because he's a product of that. As they're making their way back to Jerusalem now, there's always this siren call back to Jerusalem for the devout. Paul is a part of that. He wants to go from Tarsus back to Judea, Jerusalem, and take his place among his own people. Only when he gets there, it doesn't turn out the way that he thought, because his God, unbeknownst to him, had a different plan. And he is not going to inform Paul of that plan. He will simply make Paul submit to the plan. And now we're in the midst of that chaos, which is really kind of what it is in those journeys that Paul took, is this chaos of the gospel. Gospel really prospers in chaos. There's nothing ordered about it. Jesus went about all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and so forth, healing the sick. And the gospel went about the eastern half of the Roman Empire here and there. And it's only after you get away from it and look at the grand mosaic, you can see the genius of it all, as he makes his way to Rome. And we're in the middle of that here. So Paul, because he has nothing better to think about, is trying to process, as these Jews are kicking him, as his fellow Jews are kicking him out of synagogue after synagogue, to do a little study on how many synagogues he got kicked out of that we know of, that are recorded. It's a big theme in Acts, getting kicked out of the synagogue. I guess if you're a Jewish Christian, you're not a proper one unless you've been kicked out of a synagogue, which he has been. Anyway, he's contemplating that and its implications for the fact that now there's going to be a church made of Gentiles and Jews. And how do we get these two disparate groups, mutually irreconcilable groups from both sides, Jews and Gentiles, to give that up, to give that ancient animosity up? Jews didn't want to associate with Gentiles, and Gentiles did not like Jews. We see that, for example, in Corinth, when he's preaching in the synagogue and he gets kicked out of the synagogue, and he converts the synagogue leader of the synagogue, and then he goes next door, probably emptied out the synagogue, which they didn't appreciate. So they beat him and they drag him before the judgment seat, and somehow they get an audience with Gallio, who was the proconsul of Asia, Achaia, the province that Corinth is in, who doesn't want anything to do it with it. Jews, I don't want any part of your religious disputes. So he drives them away, but he lets the Gentiles beat on him for a while. So you can see this releasing a little bit of. I'm going to let the citizens have their way for a little while with these Jews, so they can work off some steam on it. And then you release some of the pressure maybe, and then it becomes tolerable again, and they go on their way. So you can just see it right there, that anti-Jewish sentiment. That now Paul is getting hostility from the Gentiles because he's preaching the gospel and he's insulting their gods, and he's getting it from the Jewish side because of what he's saying about the obsolescence of Moses for the Gentiles. In the middle of that, what of Israel? Because does all this mean that God has turned his back on Israel? Israel rejected its Messiah, and the gospel has turned to the Gentiles. And it does not appear to be turning back, and the churches are becoming increasingly Gentile. And that's the situation in Rome after the Jews get expelled by Claudius in 46, becomes an exclusively Gentile church. The Jews make their way back, but it's a Gentile church. And so maybe there's this attitude among the Gentiles that they have somehow replaced Israel. They're not just simply supplementing the people of God. They are a new people of God, replacing the old people of God. And the implication being that God has rejected Israel, the implication of that being that God does not keep his promises. It's a heavy duty implication. And of course, if he didn't keep his promises that time with Israel, maybe he won't keep his promises to us as well. It's about God's promising and promise keeping, and his faithfulness are the issue, I think, here. And so the question is, has Israel been rejected? And he appeals to, I've said before, history, I didn't start it, I didn't create it myself, but history that never repeats itself, it rhymes. You see the same thing happen again and again and again. And so he appeals back to the story of Elijah, where the nation went into apostasy. And from Elijah's standpoint, he is the only one left. He thought there's not a single one. They've killed all the prophets. They've killed every one of your people. There is no religion of Yahweh. There is no worship of Yahweh. It's dead. God, you lost. Because that's really what he's saying. By now, he's given up himself. He's traveled down to Midian. Why Midian? I don't know. That's where Sinai is, in my view. But he's out. He's not even in Israel anymore. He's in Midian. David went to the land of the Philistines. Maybe he would have stayed there the rest of his life. God had different plans. And Elijah went down to the land of the Midianites, both of whom are historic enemies of Israel. Seek refuge from their own people. Both of those people did that, David and Elijah. I hope all of this is true because I'm making it up as I go. God went and got him, brought him back. And in the midst of bringing him back, this is Elijah's statement of exasperation. Why would I go back to Israel? It's dead. The religion is gone. There is no worship of Yahweh. The Israelite is dead. Let's do something else. And God said, no, you don't understand how it works. I always have a remnant. You don't know about it, nor did you need to know about it, but I'll go ahead and tell you about it. You shouldn't have needed it, but I'll tell you about it anyway. I have kept 7,000. Like I always do, I have kept 7,000. So you get up, dust yourself off, eat that food, and I'm going to send you actually through Israel to the north of Israel, because Israel was a dangerous place for Elijah at that point. And he continues with his ministry. So the lesson there, the rhyming is about the remnant. And at that time, you see this principle come out of the activities of God, the history of redemption, that God works in remnants. God never loses. His ways are never dead, not because the whole nation continues with them, but because he always saves a remnant. He always keeps a remnant for himself. He's a remnant God. And Paul is saying here, just like that, history rhymes, just like that. Today, there is a remnant. And I, Paul, offer myself evidence of the remnant. He kept for himself me as well, and him and him and him. Some of them are in the church, and the Jews in the church and Rome would have thought of themselves the same way. So that's how he keeps his promise. He saves a remnant. All right. By grace, verse 6. Anybody want to say anything about that? That was like 20 straight minutes. It could have been a little mini sermon. I don't know if it was going to be right, but it would have been one. So what of Israel? Verse 7. What then? Well, we're back to what Israel was seeking. What Israel seeks, it has not obtained and will not obtain. But those who were chosen, the remnant, obtained it through grace. The rest were hardened. So we're back to he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. Chapter 9. He's back to that idea. Israel being the case in point. The remnant was the recipient of God's grace and mercy, and the rest were hardened. And that's why the apostasy happens. That's why the Messiah is rejected. God has in some sense made it that way because he works in remnants.
When he says those who were chosen, is he referring to from among Israel? Or
I think so, yes. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But those within Israel, the subset, they have received it. Why did it happen that way? It happened that way so that the scripture would be fulfilled. And because the scripture was fulfilled, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not and ears to hear not, down to this very day. Now he's, I think he's conflating two passages together, possibly. This can be hard with these guys because they don't mind doing that. It's annoying to us where they'll, there's this passage in Deuteronomy. And again, he just expected these Roman Gentiles to understand this. Are you smiling at me? What did I do? Oh, okay. Wait a minute. So you're telling me you just had a conversation with each other without ever saying a word? Oh, okay. Because I've seen that happen. It's interesting to watch married couples argue without ever saying a word. Anyway, this is Moses on the eve of the conquest that he will not participate in because of his own problem. Moses summoned all Israel. This is another covenant in Israel. I bet you didn't know there's another covenant. This one took place in Moab, I think. Yeah, Moab. It just says that probably from before. So we're on the eve, we're to the east of the Jordan. We're getting ready to go. Moses summoned all Israel, said, you have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land. The great trials which your eyes have seen, those great signs and wonders. Implying, parentheses, yet you didn't understand. You still don't understand. You still don't understand your God. Even in spite of the fact that you've seen all that. Why? To this day, there's Paul's statement, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. To this day, in spite of everything that's happened, the crossing of the sea, all of that, to this day, the fire by night and the cloud by day, the cloud in the tabernacle, the food, the quail, the bread, the water out of the rock, the safety, defeating your enemies across the desert. In spite of all that, you still don't understand. That's the nature of God's people. I've led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not worn out. Your sandals have not worn on your foot. You've not eaten bread, nor have you strong wine or drink, in order that you might know that I am the Lord your God. Yet you still don't know. That's the nature of the people. So Paul makes use of that to this very day. This statement right here. Only he extends the day from then, at the start, right after the Exodus, 1,400 years to this day. To this day. down to this very day has been radically reinterpreted. Extended from just before the conquest through the whole history of Israel, recounting everything I just said about the apostasies of Israel to this very day, when Israel en masse rejected their Messiah. That's the nature of the thing. It's a scathing indictment. And that's why they have rejected their Messiah. Because God has not given them eyes to see or ears to hear or a heart to understand, so that he can save a remnant. Then there's Isaiah chapter 6, which speaks similarly in prophecy form. That passage we've looked at before. It's one of the most misunderstood, misinterpreted passages in the entire Bible, maybe the most. Whom shall I send and who will go for us? I, Isaiah, said, here I am, send me. Go and tell this people who don't have eyes to see or ears to hear, like I said 700 years ago or something like that. Keep on listening, but do not perceive. Keep on looking, but do not understand. Because you don't have eyes to hear, eyes to see or ears to hear. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes. Jesus quotes this. We'll look at that in a minute. See with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. He wants to save a remnant. He can make these people understand if he wants. Of course he can. But he's just throwing up his hands in defeat. I can't do anything with his people. I made a big mistake. No, just how he works. You can not like it, but you know, how long will this happen? Until it is destroyed. Until cities are devastated and without inhabitant. Exile is coming. Houses are without people. The land is utterly desolate. It's around the corner. So Paul extends the day to this day, the one he's living in. Well, then Jesus, I should put this up. So let's go with Mark. Should stay with Luke because it's a similar tradition, but parable of the sower. No, let's go to the Luke one. Which one is the why? Let's see. That's not a small search. Why? Might remember where it is in Luke. Why am I not just looking for the word sower?
Yeah.
Come on, you gotta help me out. Mike was gonna get there. Let's see what Luke has to say. 8. His disciples began questioning him, verse 9, what this parable meant. They didn't understand it. They don't have eyes to see or ears to hear. He said, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to the rest, there's you, and then there's the rest. It is in parables, not so that it can be more easily understood for them, but so that Isaiah and Deuteronomy, as proof that nothing has changed since Deuteronomy chapter 29. And the prophecy of Isaiah, backlighting this whole thing, might be fulfilled, that seeing they may see and hearing they may hear, seeing they may not see and hearing they may not understand. And then he explains the parable to them, which is why it has been granted. Not their insight, but he's going to explain it to them. That's why they understand. This one.
So in Romans, is he talking to a Jewish group?
Well, that's a good question. He's the subject is Israel. The question is, who's the audience?
So he's just showing God's keeping his promise, keeping his covenant.
Yes, but that if you thought, well, he's going to show that God keeps his promise. He's not given up on Israel. He's not abandoned Israel.
Because that would show his faithfulness and keeping of his
Yes.
covenant, because the Roman church was questioning that.
It's an implication. It's hanging out there. Well, if the problem for the Roman church appears to be some kind of, if you read between the lines of 14 and 15, it's some kind of arrogance. Remember, these are very, very class-oriented people. I mean, you didn't understand a human being. You had to know what status they held in society. You needed to know whether the person you're talking to is a slave or not,
So he's breaking down the human
right?
divisions and egos and saying, I am God and I run the show.
You see it in Corinth as well, all kinds of divisions along there. And so he's going to use his own muscle to shape out of these irreconcilable groups. That's why I think one of the reasons the Jew-Gentile thing was so important. You know, you can have unity between men and husband and wife, unity between men and women. Unity between Jew and Gentile, or unity between slave and free. That's a whole different thing. I mean, that's a tough act. That's a tough thing to ask somebody to bring about. The unity of slave and free in the first century Roman Empire. I mean, these people, they just didn't think like that. I've said before, the difference to them, the difference between a Roman and a slave was the difference between a human and a non-human. Well, in the church of God, in the people of God, there is simply the people of God, one united people of God on an equal footing. Nobody has a higher claim on God. Nobody has preference. Well, how do you overcome those barriers of not race? Their idea of slavery was not based on race. They did not conquer Africa. If you look at the Roman Empire, Roman Empire. See if I got that.
Did they have a way of seeing visually when someone's a slave? And
That's a good question, probably. I mean, you could tell by maybe how they were dressed. But peasants, you know, poor Romans who lived in these destitute apartments. But this is the Roman Empire of AD 117, which is, 60 years before. But that's the Roman Empire. Well, this is sub-Saharan Africa down here. They never went down there. So if they were pulling up slaves, they were taking slaves back to Rome. Those slaves were coming from here, over here, Parthia, whatever, or over here, the Gauls, or whoever they took, Spain, whatever lands they conquered. Well, none of that was based on race.
And in Rome, all of these ethnicities would be there.
Yeah, you couldn't necessarily tell the difference by skin color. We tend to think of slavery in the American context is very specific. Right? If you were walking around in Atlanta, Georgia in 1850, it was pretty easy to tell who the slaves were. Atlanta doesn't look like it looks now, but it's pretty easy to tell. Well, back in those days, and then maybe you had a similar understanding of status. You thought of the slave in 1850s Atlanta the way that they thought of the slave in the sixth decade of the first century BC AD. The difference is you had to find out first. You couldn't just see it. You couldn't see the status. They didn't wear their status on their skin necessarily. I mean, the guy might have been a wealthy Spaniard. You see the movie, I know it's ridiculous, Gladiator. This wealthy Spaniard who was a Roman general earns the ire of the next emperor, and they go back and they burn his house and crucify his family and so forth. And he gets sold into slavery. He becomes a slave. They didn't know that the slave is actually this honored Roman general until the end of the movie and so forth. But the point is, you couldn't tell by looking. Either way, it just didn't make itself obvious. But once you found out that this man is a slave, everything changed. I mean, you just see him with those eyes, and you couldn't assess somebody until you knew what were they. You needed to know whether a person was a slave or a Roman, and if he's a Roman, is he an equestrian person in the equestrian class, or is he a person in the senatorial class? Where is he even in the hierarchy of that? Paul was neither one of those. Was he a prominent citizen in Tarsus or Ephesus, or was he not? You needed to know all that. Now you want to bring all these disparate people. Was the woman a noble woman, which you see in Acts, or was she not a noble woman? But you need, if you're now gonna have a church with all these people in it, and they're all thrown together. And the natural impulse of what they've been trained to do from birth you begin to categorize humans again. It's this natural thing people do. According to your systems, the systems that have been trained in, which may not even be obvious to you. You may not have any idea that you're even doing it. It's just done by impulse. And so he's, this Roman, Paul, from a well-to-do family in Tarsus, that may have owned slaves. Who knows? He's trying to shape a church, shape churches along this idea of one united people of God, who have an equal footing, where there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. Interesting turn of words there from the Roman. Self-deprecating. There is neither Jew nor Greek. That makes sense. Roman nor slave. Who would put slave first? Because word order matters in Greek. He puts slave first. Naturally denigrating himself, who was a Roman. Puts the Roman second in that part, male nor female. So you can see the natural precedence from their point of view on the two that bracket it, Jew nor Greek, which is synonymous with Gentile, and male nor female. But in the middle, interesting thing he did, obliterating class distinction in the middle there. He's doing it in the whole passage. There is neither Jew nor Greek and male nor female. But just to make the point, I'm gonna denigrate myself right in the middle of it, slave nor free, and everybody would have got the point. And if you're a Roman in the church, you're reading this. That was written to the Galatians, I think. You're reading this, and that just ain't right. I'm a Roman. I'm not taking second place to a slave. Doesn't matter what color they are, no matter what they were before. They might have been the biggest farmer in their province, in their area back in Spain or something. I don't care. They're a slave. I'm a Roman. That's how they do these things. That's how they roll back then. He's trying to, so these guys in Rome, you got these Jews and you got these Gentiles. It's very easy for the Gentiles to imagine that God has given them preference. They're gonna do what the Jews did. The Jews thought of themselves as favored and therefore superior in some way. Now they're going to do the same thing. Paul's going to intercept it, say, no. They didn't flip it. He obliterated it. It's false that the Jews had their day and now the Gentiles are going to have theirs at the expense of the Jews. Well, actually, it's going to be temporarily true, but not for the reasons that you think. No. He's not replacing, he's adding to. He's transforming by addition, not by replacement.
Also, I think a lot of Paul's writings, he used the history of Israel as an example to say this is how the Israelites were. They were the people of God. This is how they fall away from God. I mean, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It gives an exact history of how Israel was fallen and how they dispraise God. I think he does that a lot of his writings.
Yeah.
Israel as an example of how we're not supposed to turn away from God, but the Israelites have. And so, to answer your question, if he's talking to the Roman Church or if he's talking to Jews, he's talking about both, but he's also at the same time he's using Israel history, a lesson to the Gentiles, how you're not supposed to, this is the history of Israel and how they went, their history is up and down with God. And he's trying to say you're not supposed to be up and down, you're supposed to be even. So what we use the Israelites as the Jews as an example of how you're not supposed to live the Christian life.
And understand yourself. It's easy, isn't it easy how much you can take on the weakness of another person without, you can hate their weakness and then replicate it in yourself. It's the weirdest thing. Another example, of course, is Hebrews, where the apostasy of Israel and the Exodus generation is the backdrop of that whole book. Anyway, remnant, that's the point here.
So pull the focus off of yourself and what you think, put it on God, because he's running. Like Jews went through this history in Gentiles, you may be trying that same vein. Take your eyes off yourself.
Yeah,
Look at
it's,
what God's doing.
he's gonna be attacking this idea of being puffed up. He loves that kind of language. Do not be puffed up. Here it's gonna be, do not be conceited, but fear. The antidote here is that you're gonna think you're gonna think there's merit involved here. That you're now favored for some reason. That was the mistake they made. Do not make that mistake. Look to it as an example of make sure that you don't do the same thing. Fear. Don't be arrogant, but fear. Because if he didn't spare them, you're not immune either. He won't spare you, which makes us very uncomfortable because it implies we individualize everything. So it implies, stuff about losing your salvation, but he just says it here coming up. Very, very strong word for a church he's never met before, which is why a lot of people think that they're having this problem. The Jews have come back. They're making their way back into the church. Priscilla, Aquila, who have been in this a long time, founded churches on the eastern, in other provinces. They come back to Rome, and the Gentiles have an attitude. They have exactly the same attitude potentially that the Jews would have had in the synagogue. No, this is not a synagogue where we have first and second class citizens. That's not the church. That's been conquered in Christ. That's finished. I'm not going to do that. So that's some kind of conflation, or what's the word for that? It sounds negative. Combining together of maybe two different passages, Deuteronomy 29 and Isaiah 6. Then he goes on to a psalm. David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. So this, once again, to Israelites, to his fellow Israelites, that's a quotation from Psalm 69. He did this a lot too. The enemies, remember, the enemies are often in the Psalms, the enemies of God are the Israelites. It's a very self-contained, the Old Testament is very self-contained. The enemy is usually from within. Occasionally there's a battle with an external enemy, but that an address in the Psalms is almost always about an internal enemy, Israelites themselves. All right. But he's just making a point about Israel's hardened heart, so to speak, corporately as a nation. Don't get caught up in the individualizing of this. He's talking about the entities here, the Israel itself as a nation, as the people of God. And when he talks about, in a minute, when he's going to talk about if he didn't spare them, Israel, he won't spare you, the church. So be careful about individualizing that, wherein we get the idea of losing your salvation. We'll get back to that. We'll talk about all that later. So here now's the implication, verse 11. Oh, I should probably look at my notes. I wrote on all this stuff I don't really want to say now. Implication being that God has rejected his people, verse 11. He's going to make it obvious. He's going to make it transparent. This is a new section, in a sense, 11 through what? 17? 11 through 15. I say then, there's one of his famous rhetorical questions that demands an absolutely not answer. I think there's seven of them in Paul's writing, or in this book. We'll go look at them maybe later. I say then, did they stumble so as to fall away? May it never be. On the contrary, but by their transgression, their transgression had a purpose. By their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. And if you think about the progress of the gospel, back to my favorite map, I didn't get the name of it again. What did I call that one? My favorite map of ancient Israel. Huh?
Call it my favorite map.
Then I'd be looking for it still because I got to find the hymns. Think about the gospel going to Samaria. I know I've talked about that, man. I want to find it. Give me a minute. Tribes. Huh. Wouldn't like that one. Now it. Huh, I don't know what's going on right now. It's like it lost the file associations. Anyway, just a minute. There it is. Palestine, it's called Palestine. Which, in light of what's going on in the world right now, probably Israel wouldn't appreciate me calling it Palestine. I learned something about that too, in my obsession with Israel and Palestine.
So why is the map called Palestine? Is that like an old label?
That's a great question. Rome. The Romans called it Syria Palestinia or something like that. They created and they wanted to replace the use of Judea after they threw the Jews out the second time permanently, Hadrian. I
So it's
think,
meant to be that area,
Yeah.
not the nation.
but not because there's a certain people there that were the Palestinians, but because they wanted to erase this idea of Judea. And so they made it an extension of Syria. They thought of it as an extension of Syria because it was part of the Syrian province, the province of Syria. So it's Syria, Palestinia, or something like that. I don't know. I probably got the details, but I'm going to go look it up and fix myself next week. Anyway, if you remember, by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And he's speaking about history here because that's exactly what happened with Samaria. The boot came down on the Christians in Jerusalem, of which Saul was a part of, and they just scattered. And so because of that Jewish rejection of the gospel, that's what the persecution was about, they ended up in Samaria and then Cyrene and then Cyprus, and then eventually in Antioch. And that's how the gospel, literally how the gospel came to the Gentiles, because of Israelite rejection of the gospel. And this is the classic example of it right here. Totally by not accident, but contingent. It had nothing to do with any plan on the part of any Christians in Jerusalem. It's not like they had a plan to take the gospel to the Gentile and to the Samaritans. That's the furthest thing from their minds. So he jump-started it this way. Paul picks up the insight through revelation without question, supernatural inspiration, that he's just speaking about history here. By their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And the reaction against him, he would view as, one of the things they didn't like was that he's going into these synagogues and he's converting these Gentiles. Because, if you're a Jew in Corinth, you have these Gentiles who come in, these God-fearing Gentiles, well, they might be men of status. You don't care if some slave becomes a proselyte. What you do care about is one of the leading citizens becomes a proselyte or a God-fearer. You care about that. That's influence, right? That's status. So that guy's in your synagogue. Well, here comes Paul. Paul converts him to Christ. He becomes a Christian. He leaves the synagogue. There goes your status seeking. They don't like that kind of thing. That's how it was done. So there's the jealousy element. I'm just imagining this could happen this way. So there goes the jealousy thing, and that inflames the ire that earns him the ire of these people. And you can see that salvation going to the Gentiles because of their transgression, and then the jealousy part as these Gentiles are then pulled away from potentially the synagogues that they become part of as second-class citizens. That's what I think is going on here. So he's speaking theologically, but he's also speaking just by reading history. This is his experience for the last 7 years. Now, if their transgression, it's 10:15, we gotta stop. I didn't hardly get anywhere. How'd you guys let this happen? Did I really talk for a whole hour? Wow. All right, we gotta stop. That's all right. We're still gonna get this book done in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and shut this down.